And he's so special, in fact, that I want to keep him for the next 4 episodes. And we'll talk about 4 distinct topics in those episodes. Inshallah, we'll talk about the evolution of technology in this episode. In the following episode, we'll talk about educational technology. And after that, we'll talk about smart collaborative, and we'll explain what that is. And then lastly, excuse me, we'll talk about the vision of the future for technology. Our guest today, his name is Mr. Fardan. He's an educational technologist, and he is the CEO of Smart Collaborative. So, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So today, let's discuss this topic of the evolution of technology.
Okay.
Okay. And I know you, I've been knowing you for some years, and many people don't know that you've been involved in technology for over 40 years.
Yes, I have.
And also, but looking at you, people might think that you're my age, but you're more like a father to me.
Yes.
So getting right into it, can you give us some background of your experience in technology over the past 40 years? How did it start out compared to how it is today?
Okay. Well, basically, I started when IBM produced their first PC, which was the XT. Very old computer. Okay. They came out with 2 versions simultaneously, the 8086 and the 8088. I started by basically taking them apart, looking at the components, trying to understand how they fit in relationship to motherboard. And from there, I sort of wandered into a word processing class and began to play around with the keyboards. When I got to advanced word processing, I sort of fell in love with technology.
So what were those old computers? What were you able to do with those computers?
Well, the XT basically had a very large configuration. We're talking about it dealt with a floppy drive, 5 1/4 floppy drive, and those computers basically were designed for people that understood programming languages. You know, they had no user interface at all.
Okay. So not like Windows.
No, nothing like Windows at all.
What we know today, like the GUI.
Yes.
So it's basically like DOS or something like that.
Yes, the operating system was DOS.
Okay.
DOS.
So you would have to know some type of. I mean, okay, even the programmer, what could he make that computer do?
Well, a programmer would be able to make the computer do basically whatever he wanted to.
Okay.
Okay. On the other hand, an end user would have to run application programs. Like it had the ability to do word processing, you know, some mathematical calculations, some basic database.
Okay. Okay. So would a person use it to, when you talk about word processing, would a person use it to like print documents or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So it wasn't that far behind.
No, it wasn't that far behind. There was a printer associated with it. We called it a dot matrix printer.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
You remember those printers?
Yeah, I remember with the holes in the
exactly
that you rip off.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean that's the start. So where did you go from there after you went to the advanced word processing?
After I
program?
Discovered that I was a computer person, you would call it. You know, I was a computer person. I was very attracted to this technology. I was really blessed to be able to land a job inside of a tech room.
Okay.
I stayed in that tech room for about 8 years.
What's a tech room?
A tech room is a room where we basically learn how to assemble and reassemble the PC.
Okay.
I stayed in there and learned the PC like the back of my hand, like understanding every component on the motherboard, the hard drive, the floppy drive, the cables, you know, how you differentiate from a floppy drive cable to a hard drive cable, what was the red line on the cable, what did it represent. I stayed in there until I learned it well.
So was it like, when you talk about the tech room, was it like a repair shop?
The tech room was a repair shop. It was a repair shop. It was a lab where we tested out software. We built computers, test computers, And we had walk-ins. People walked in, you know, had computer problems. We diagnosed those problems and repaired them.
Now, I mean, just so we're not confused, this was after the DOS.
No, actually,
or was it
actually,
during that time?
this was during this transitioned from the DOS period. And Windows was I think we had something like Windows 5.1.
Okay.
Okay, so this was the transitional period between DOS stayed around a very long time.
Right.
Okay, so when Windows, even when Windows was up and running, people were still using DOS. Okay.
So when did the computer become more like a household, something that every family needed? Like today, you can't go into a house, generally speaking, where you won't find a computer, like a television or a telephone or something like that.
We're talking in the 90s, really.
So back then, it was more or less for what, business purposes? Or?
It primarily for business purposes. It was very, very expensive. First of all, very expensive, so not everyone could afford one. Right. Computers was costing something like, basic computers was costing something like $10,000.
Wow.
If you didn't have $10,000, you just didn't own a computer.
Right.
Okay. Was popular, but not affordable.
What about size?
Size, compared to the day, didn't really make that different.
Oh, okay.
In terms of the casing.
Right.
We saw the difference in size in terms of components.
Okay.
Okay, we had hard drives that were basically about this size, and floppy drives were about this size.
Right.
You know, and they were about that thick.
Right.
Okay, very, very heavy piece of hardware. So basically, what they did was they left the casing relatively the same size, and they compressed the components.
Okay.
Which allowed them to add more components.
So what about space and stuff like that? Like now we see terabyte drives.
We have terabyte drives now. Those days we had the largest size hard drive was a 10 megabyte. We had 5 megabytes and 10 megabytes.
So what can you do with that?
Believe it or not, in those days you could do everything. It just seems that way. With 10 megabytes, you could do whatever you want to do.
Okay.
You know?
Okay.
Because remember, the application program itself was much smaller.
Okay.
And we were just basically using the word processor and maybe some elementary database software.
Okay. So, I mean, after that, after you worked in the tech room, where did you go from there?
Well, from the tech room, I went to a computer company and worked as a technician. Okay. I worked for a company called Washington Computer Services. Okay. Washington Computer Services had tied basically with the major industry. And that sort of opened up my eyes to who was out there. Novell, Cisco, Oracle, all of the big boys. Okay. So I worked as a field engineer.
So this sounds like networking.
I moved up into networking,
okay,
you know, as a field engineer, and we basically built scalable networks.
Okay. Tell us about networks then and networks now compared. Is it basically the same? Or?
Well, the idea and the concept of networks probably will never change. Okay. Will never change because the basic idea of a network is to share the resources. Okay. No matter what the network is, large, small, the reason why we use them is to share networks. Okay. Networks are much more sophisticated now than they were when I was using them. Okay. We were basically running Novell. Okay. And Novell was the most stable network operating system at that time.
Okay. What about now?
Now,
where does Novell sit in it?
I'm sort of prejudiced when it comes to Novell. I still believe that Novell is a very solid, stable networking system, but there are many of them out there now. Okay. You know, Microsoft is a giant in the market now in terms of networking platforms.
So, realistically, which one would you say is better?
Better?
Novell or Microsoft?
Personally, I would always go with Novell.
Because you're prejudiced, right?
Because I'm prejudiced, yes.
Type. Okay, your work with networks. Tell us a bit about that.
I got to understand how to deal with the client and the server. I got to understand the nature of the server, what the server is about, you know, and really how to build networks. You know, I understood the components of networks up until we moved into wireless networking, which is what we consider what's going on now.
Right. So where were you at when the internet started to become popular? When people started having home computers, you know?
Well, I guess I was one of those that I jumped right on it as soon as it came out.
Oh, okay.
You know, as soon as we had access to the internet, I jumped on it, and I learned to use the internet by searching, by looking for items related to technology.
Okay. So
manufacture items and things of that nature.
So that's how you used the internet when it first came out.
Yes.
What about companies? I mean, weren't companies some of the first to jump on the internet and start?
Yes. Companies were the first, as a matter of fact. The internet was only accessible through companies at one time.
Okay. Well, I mean, this is a very good conversation, and we have to take a short break, and we'll be back with Mr. Fardan, inshallah, in the next 30 seconds or the next minute or so, inshallah. We'll see you after the break.
Can we talk?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to Tech Talk. I'm your host, Omar Shear, and again, we have a very special guest with us today, Mr. Fardan. He's an educational technologist, and he's also the CEO of Smart Collaborative. Welcome back in this section. We left off the last segment talking about the internet.
Yes.
And how you use the internet early on. But now let's talk about today's technology.
Okay.
And did you foresee any of this coming back then, or where is it going, or where was the like what was the objective to get us where we are today, as far as technology is concerned?
Well, you know, Umar, what I understood first about technology when I first got introduced to it, when I started studying it, was that the idea of technology was to make it so that it would be invisible to the naked eye. We would be able to use it, but we wouldn't be able to see it. As technology evolved throughout the years, I've noticed that we were able to take components, compress them, make the device itself much smaller. But the basic architect of the PC has not changed. We've always had hard drives. We've always had motherboards. We still use RAM.
Right.
You know, we still rely on the BIOS to tell us what the motherboard can stand.
Okay.
You know, we still use cases, even though the architect of cases have changed from desktop to mini towel to mid towel to towel, you know, back to desktops.
Right.
So in terms of from the time I started up until today, the end user is using basically the same machine, but the machine has more of a capacity and it is more faster.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because you were saying that the hard drive back then was what, 10 megabytes or something?
5 and 10 megabytes, yes.
Now we have
terabytes.
Gigabytes on the
Yes.
flash.
Yes, exactly.
So the hard drive was big like this, like a VCR or something like
Exactly.
that. And then now we have something small like a USB drive.
Yes.
But when you talk about invisible to the naked eye, you mean that these devices are getting smaller and smaller over time, or?
The devices are getting smaller and smaller over time. But when I talk about invisible to the naked eye, I'm talking about we're not even going to be able to see it. We're going to be able to use it without seeing it.
But of course it would be some technician somewhere with some type of microscope that can work, you know.
Yes, of course. Yes. There will be some device, but the device may be smaller than we could really imagine.
Right. So I mean, I didn't know that. You know, that's something new to me. And I have noticed that now, for example, we have tablets, and
Yep.
these tablets work as like mini computers.
Yes.
And I can imagine that they would be a computer at some point.
Exactly. Well, for all intents and purposes, we consider them a computing device now. Yes.
Because technically for a normal user, he doesn't need to do programming or graphics or something like that. So his word processing, his email, and the things that he needs daily are right here on the tablet.
Yes.
So with keeping these things in mind, like networking, some people in some places may not see the benefit of a network.
Okay.
So could you give it to us in layman's terms, like what is the actual benefit? You said sharing resources, but okay.
Well, say you own a large company.
Okay.
And you have a certain number of employees.
Right.
You have to purchase software for each employee. That software requires you to have a license.
Okay.
The license is a tidy sum,
Okay.
whatever it may be.
Right.
It could be £300 or £400.
Right.
But if you have to buy 500 licenses, then that tidy sum becomes a large sum.
Yeah.
Whereas in a network, you can buy a network edition of a software
Right.
that will allow you a certain number of connections per users. So you pay for this software, and then you pay for the additional connections. So you save in terms of cost on software.
Okay.
But again, for the purpose of the network, sharing the resources, users can access the server, and they can store the information on the server. They can share the information on the server.
Okay.
They can share software on the server.
Right.
Okay. So network has the sharing the resource, and also enables you to cut costs in terms of software.
And the licensing and that.
And the license of software, yes.
Okay. So, compared to when you first started in networking and now, what's the big difference in terms of setting up networks, in terms of servers, in terms of?
Well, now we're able to connect with anybody, anywhere. Okay, when we first started out, this is very difficult because the network is bandwidth dependent.
Okay.
Okay, and we have various types of networks. You know, we have the LAN, the WAN, and now we can cross boundaries. You know,
What do you mean boundaries?
well, boundaries like we can contact. We're sitting here in Egypt. All right, we can access a server in Alaska, for example, or anywhere in the world.
Right.
You know, via the internet or via fiber optic cable.
So, in terms of speed.
Speed definitely has increased. You know, speed is a major thing when it comes to network, and speed over the years has increased, and prices have decreased.
And what would be the difference between, let's say, processing, if a user is on their computer and it's moving too slow for them, or it's not, it's not as fast as they would like it to be. Is this an issue of the processing, or is
it's a combined issue.
Okay.
Excuse me. One is that, of course, we gauge this processing power in hertz, in megahertz. So the processor itself is important because it's the speed. It's the CPU, the central processing unit. This is important. But there has to be a balance. You have the processor, but then you also have the RAM. Okay? So you need a certain amount of RAM, a certain type of processor going at a certain speed, and then you need a certain amount of storage space. See? Because if you have a good processor, but you don't have the resources, which is the RAM,
Right.
then no matter how fast your processor is, then your resources are slow.
Okay. So, as far as the computers that you dealt with before, the IBMs, was it IBM?
IBM, yes, IBM XT.
The IBM. At that time, there were Macintoshes, right?
There were Macintoshes. There was Commodore 64, Commodore 128.
What were the differences? Just different companies, or
Different
at that time? I know it's a
different
big difference
companies.
now.
Yeah, different companies. Different operating systems. They were proprietary operating systems. You
Okay.
know? Of course, XT was basically running off of DOS, and Apple had their own operating system.
Okay. And what about the Commodore?
Commodore again had their own operating system.
So obviously Apple has become more popular now.
Mm-hmm.
It was it was popular back then too as well, right?
Not as popular.
Not as popular.
No, not as popular.
And then it phased out. Did
Mm-hmm.
it phase out completely, or
It didn't phase out completely, but it did phase out for some period of time.
and then it ended up coming back?
Yes,
I believe that was when Steve Jobs came back.
exactly.
And but is there any reason why you didn't go the Macintosh route? I mean, did you see that the PC was the future of computing, or just
Not so much that I felt it was the future of computing. People they usually stick with they're first introduced with, and they get comfortable.
Right.
Like in my case,
right?
you know, I was introduced to the IBM DOS system.
Right.
I learned it well. I was used to it. I didn't see a need to branch out and really go to Macintosh, even though I dealt with the Commodore. Commodore was like a toy, but you know, it was a learnable toy.
Right.
And I think at that time I viewed it all the same.
So you didn't have business or career or anything in mind?
No. I just fell in love with computers at that time.
And what was it about computers? You know, realistically, now I can see a person fall in love with computers.
I think it was
But
the
at that
fact.
time-
I think it was the fact that it was a machine, and it did what I wanted it to do. You know, and I got past the intimidation. And like I tell people, it's a machine. If it don't act right, just unplug it, and it'll just shut down. You know, so I enjoyed it. You know, and again, I love working with my hands.
Right.
You know, I learned to build them well, and that was part of the enjoyment. Building them, installing the operating system on them, getting them to work was the big thing for me.
Do you remember who introduced you to your first computer? Not to know the person's name.
Yeah.
And,
No, I can't remember like exactly who. I know who introduced me to word processing.
Okay.
But my first computer, I think I just sort of stumbled up on it. I don't think I got like a formal introduction for, listen, this is an XT and you got to get acquainted with it. But I think I sort of stumbled on it.
Right.
And I started collecting junk.
Okay.
You know, and just playing with it. And found out that this is for me.
And was there any relationship between the early computers and video games that came out in the 80s? Like Atari? Are you familiar with Atari?
Yes, I am familiar with Atari. I
Really
think
cool.
all of it relates. All of it relates in terms of a form of technology.
Right.
Yes.
Because these were the things that we were introduced in my generation.
Yes.
That was like our first computer, but it really wasn't a computer.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're going to wrap this show up, and we're going to try to keep you around for a few more episodes because you have some very good information to share with us on this show. Is there anything you want to say about technology then and now before we close the subject?
Well, again, looking back then and looking now, I think that there are more people involved in technology now than they were then. When I came to Egypt about 16 years ago, I came with the idea of opening up a tech shop.
Right.
The people in Alexandria told me that I was crazy. This was 16 years ago. They told me that, forget it. It will never work in Egypt. But 16 years later, everybody here in some form or fashion is involved in technology. So just the basic spread, the basic awareness of technology in a 16-year period here was astronomical.
That being said, we're going to wrap up this this episode of Tech Talk. And I really want you to tune in next week because we'll be talking about educational technology. And I'm sure many of you have children in schools, and the schools are using technologies in the classroom. And Mr. Fard has some very good experience in dealing with schools and technology. And we really want to go deep into this subject in our next episode. Excuse me. So with that being said, I would like to say thank you for joining us for this episode of Tech Talk. And inshallah ta'ala, we'll see you next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.